Welcome to In the Demo, a show about the stories that get told about groups, how those stories got made, what we think those stories get wrong, and why it matters. You hosts? Farrah Bostic is the founder and head of research and strategy of The Difference Engine, a strategic insights consultancy focused on helping business leaders make decisions. Adam Pierno, author and brand consultant and managing director of brand strategy at Arizona State University. You are now in the demo.
I'm Adam Pierno, Generation X.
And I'm Farrah Bostic, the Apple IIe generation.
Hey, how many of these are there? Like, do you have enough to do the whole season with these nicknames? I could tell you're
at a certain point
scrounging.
it's true. I'm now taking some artistic license and creating my own.
Okay. All right.
Based
Well, maybe
on,
we can,
kind of cultural artifacts that seem to define that period. So
we know people. I bet you we could get these injected into the culture and get them mainstreamed, or at least added to a Huffington Post.
It's true.
list.
I would. Oh, totally. Yeah. More HuffPo articles about the Apple IIe generation for sure.
Perfect.
And how we're totally shaping culture
Oh, every
in
day.
our late 40s.
Every day. People love hearing from us people in our mid 40s. We're driving culture every day.
Absolutely.
When we
single day.
last left off, Farrah, if you remember,
Yes.
we looked at the text for millennials rising. And we had, as we usually do, some questions about methodology, about the way the data was considered and assembled and the narrative that was built on top of it. And some of that is due in part to the way that the data is referenced in the indices of the book, which is a little vague. So we did a couple of things. We did some of our own research, as we're wont to do because we are nerds. And we also reached out to some people that were participants in the book. We reached out to some people that have a really good background of the area in which the research was done, which is the beautiful McLean, Virginia.
Yes.
Are you excited?
I'm so excited. I'm so excited to talk about McLean, Virginia, a place that I think I've driven past.
I haven't been there.
Times.
I haven't been there yet, but I think the more people that I've spoken to preparing for this episode, the more I would like to visit there. It seems like a lovely place, and everybody that I've met from there is like gracious and lovely and
That's nice.
friendly. So it seems like a nice place to stop and have a cocktail, at the very least.
We should do that. We should do like a New York Times style, like find a diner.
Oh, I love it.
If such a thing exists in McLean, and just like bring our microphones and talk to people at the diner. Do you think there are diners in McLean, Virginia, though?
That's a great question. Based on the demographics and the economic data that we're pulling, I'm not sure there are diners. I think there probably are a bunch of like white tablecloth steakhouses we could go to.
Perhaps a bistro.
Exactly. I'm not sure if there's like a Fox News style or like New York Times diner style highway diner where you could just go get the everyman's opinion. So I think we'd have to figure that part out.
Yes.
But
yes,
we did.
Right.
So if you didn't listen to the previous episode, you're probably going to want to go back and do that because in the book Millennials Rising, a lot of the conclusions that are presented there are based on research the authors did. They did use some national data, but they also did some research into the area in which they lived, McLean, Virginia. And as we were reading Millennials Rising, and as we were having these conversations, Farrah and I both came to a pretty quick observation that is McLean. I didn't know anything about it, but I thought, is that a good representation of the United States or like globally? Because we're making some pretty big assertions about what could be 100 million people. We probably want to make sure we have a rep sample. And that led us down this, it's not quite a rabbit hole, but it led us down this path of doing some research, which is the kind of standard research both Farrah and I would do as part of our regular work, better understanding an audience, better understanding a group, better understanding a demographic set, and trying to get to the bottom of what works and what doesn't. So before we talk about the data, Farrah, I shared a spreadsheet with you that is comparative between McLean, Virginia, Fairfax County, which is where McLean is located, and the United States Census, both from the year 2000, around the time Millennials Rising was written, and 2020. So I just thought we could extrapolate out and see, like, well, what's happened since then? And
Yeah.
what was your reaction upon looking at the data in those rows and those columns?
I think I sort of instinctively thought about, like, having looked at a map at some point in time, that given the physical location of both McLean and Fairfax, that this was probably not an area that was like a perfect microcosm of the general population of the United States. It's super close to DC, to the Pentagon, to major government institutions, federal government institutions. And so just like my surmise would have been, this is a lot of federal employees or federal contractors or military, and that it's just not going to look like, I don't know, Hillsboro, Oregon, where I went to high school. It's just not going to look like that spot. And so when we opened this up, I was like, well, it does not look like America, but the ways it doesn't look like America are particularly interesting. Like it's, that was the first thing that stood out to me.
It looks like
and then it seems to be looking less like America over time.
Yes.
Right? It kind of got worse.
In the year 2000, it looks like a version of America. It looks like the America that was on movie screens in the year 2000. Like it is.
Totally. That's a really good way to describe it.
It's not that diverse. And I do want to go back to Millennials Rising. When they reference the research they did in McLean, and what they did was some surveys of high school students and educators in McLean, Virginia. And that makes sense. That's a good way to get to that audience. But they say that, I don't have the language right in front of me, but they say this represents a demographic match. And I think what they meant was racially. And if you look racially, I mean, if you squint at it, it's
close.
It's close. It's close enough that I wouldn't throw a tantrum, although the percentage of Asian alone is a real distortion that probably breaks their numbers, but that would depend on knowing what the high school census was. But what they leave out is the economic representation. And in some of the early conversations we had with people from McLean and other people, right off the bat, like when we just start scrolling through I'm looking at basic census data. This is not genius level research that I did. I'm not making 7 lily pad jumps. This is median value of owner-occupied housing units. In 2000, the median for the United States per the census was $119,000 median value of their home. And in McLean, Virginia, it's $388,000. So more than 3 times the amount. That is, statistically speaking, eye-popping. That's a huge disparity. So right there, if your house is worth 3 times the national average, you have a different set of values, a different set of challenges, a different set of fears, a different lifestyle. And it suggests other things about the safety of your neighborhoods, the quality of your schools. Like we can infer all of that from starting with that stat. That's not the only stat. What's the next stat that jumped out to you? That for me, I was like, oh, that tells me everything I need to know. And then looking at how it's changed over 20 years, it's almost 5x now.
Yeah, I think the other thing that stood out to me was the education representation. So the bachelor's degree or higher, that, that's been growing in the United States over time, but it's still like a third of the US at this point in time has at least a bachelor's degree. In 2000, it's about a quarter have a bachelor's degree, but in McLean, 3/4 have a bachelor's degree or higher. The high school graduation rate is nearly 100%, whereas it's about 80% in 2000 for the rest of the US. So this is a highly educated area as well. It's also like outperforming the county it's in by more than 2 times.
That's
on
on
the bachelor's degree.
Yes, and that's why I pulled that county data, because if you're, I'm so glad you highlighted this stat, because then if you say we went to students and in McLean schools and educators, and that's where our research ended, what that tells me is you're getting input from very high performing students with a high persistence and success rate who have a particular outlook because they are supported by educated teachers who are living comfortable lives. Now I'm extrapolating, so guilty as charged, but it's a pretty safe extrapolation that those students will have a certain outlook and a certain opinion about learning and about, the future and about what's possible because of the background they have. There's a privilege at stake here.
Absolutely. And we've talked about this in other contexts, but like if your parents are working as contractors or employees, or they are serving in the federal government or the military, like your attitude towards those institutions is going to be different than people whose immediate family don't do that.
Yes.
And that's not to say that like your cynicism might not grow over time, but like as a kid, look, I mean, my dad worked for a couple of years for ADP, and I still have some sort of like very way down deep kind of reaction when I see ADP ads where I'm like, oh, that's a nice place. I have no idea if it's a nice place or not, but gave my dad a job for a couple of years. Had one of those cool like static electricity balls in the lobby that you could touch and all the electricity would go to your hand. That's what I remember. So it must be awesome at ADP.
I think you're
right. When I was 8, that was pretty awesome. And, so that's also an interesting kind of point about how these economic factors in particular might influence people's attitudes to certain other things you ask them about in a survey. And I think it is worth saying, like it is reasonably, with the exception of being more than 3 times the national rate of Asian alone households, which has kind of held steady over time. With the exception of that, it's fairly racially representative of the U.S. It's a little whiter, but it's not so much to your point that you'd be annoyed about it. It's much less Black or African American.
Yes,
but you could kind of, like you say, squint and say, well, it's reasonably diverse, and so we can say that it's representative on that basis. But once you start getting into income and the cost of living, it's so out of proportion to the rest of the country that starts to really inflect how you would even begin to understand any of the rest of the demographics.
Yeah,
because the way that they're living, the types of homes, the parents' employers, all of that.
Yeah, so
is going to change the way you think about the world.
Yeah, especially if I agree with you, the ends are too small on the racial demographics to get too worked up about. So especially their authors knew the school, so I'll just take their word for it that it was somewhat representative. When you look at, there is no data for the year 2000, but for 2020, if you look at foreign-born persons as a percent, in the United States, that's 13%, 13.5%. And in 2020 in McLean, Virginia, as a point of comparison, it's 10 points higher. It's 23.5%. So just that makeup, like let's say that is consistent, or even if it's gone up, maybe we go back in time and say in 2000, maybe it was 10%. That's a big difference too, that you're surrounded by a global population, or you have access to perspectives from people there. I know that there are diplomats that live in that area. I know that there are people that are world travelers. That having access to that experience, even secondhand, is a game changer in how you view the world. People who live in an insulated community, they only can see their small town and whatever's proposed through the news or through media. So I think that's also one from a creating a perspective. That's another metric that is really telling. And I couldn't find in the 2000 census, I just couldn't find foreign-born persons as a measure that was captured then.
Well, and I think the other one that stood out for me was the poverty rate. That in 2000, it's just below 2% for the U.S. as a whole. It was 11%. I mean, that's so a fifth of the rate of poverty in this area. It's gone down even since then. According to the 2020 census, 1% of people in McLean are living in poverty versus, again, about 11% of Americans. And so, the rate of home ownership is higher than the national average. The rate of poverty is significantly lower. I mean, wildly lower than the national average. What you're being exposed to on on one end of the curve is more diverse, more cosmopolitan, more diverse, quote unquote, in the sense of like foreign born households and that sort of thing. It's more cosmopolitan, it's more affluent, it's more perhaps, kind of world outward facing. But it is missing the experience of being a renter.
Yes.
Of being around kids who live in Section 8 housing, being around kids whose parents work multiple jobs to afford rent in a shitty apartment. Like, these kids aren't growing up knowing a bunch of people like that. That, again, is going to color the way that they respond to different kinds of questions on a survey.
Yes.
About how they feel about society and their place in it.
And that point about renting is huge. It's in the year 2000, it was 66% owner occupied housing rate for the United States, and 20 points higher, 85.3% in McLean, Virginia, to make your point. That is a different set of pressures. That is a different set of standards. That is a certain type of privilege. That's a certain luxury that people have, and definitely colors the perspective that people would have about what life is and what's possible in life.
Yeah. When you start thinking about the types of things that came out of that 2000 era set of research that they did, where these students in Fairfax County, McLean, Virginia schools were trusting of institutions, thought that the government in general was trying to do good, had positive, trusting relationships with their parents, generally thought that their futures were all up and to the right, everything was going to be great, and that they would be, better off than their parents, all of those kinds of beliefs of forward-looking positivity and hopefulness. It's kind of like, well, when you look at these numbers, you just kind of go, well, sure, you're already on third base. Like, what would make you think that you wouldn't get knocked straight into home? Like, you would think that. And that's not what the average experience or the median experience of people in the US is. And so they're exposed to some things lots of people aren't exposed to, and then they're just completely not exposed to a whole bunch of things most people are exposed to. And so there's just some disproportionality there. And I think this actually really gets to something we'll talk about more when we dig into the methods of studying these demographic cohorts, is like, there's the on paper diversity stuff, right? The basic demographics of age and race and gender and ethnicity and those kinds of things. And then there's like, what are the elements of that shape kind of, for want of a better phrase, because it gets used by unfortunate people, viewpoint diversity. Like that is the thing that's tricky. And so looking at some of these more socioeconomic factors give you some clues about what might be driving the viewpoints that are expressed beyond the basic demographics of age, race, gender.
Well, we were lucky to be introduced to some very important people that we'll jump to next in this episode. And I'm really looking forward to those conversations.
We're going to get the kind of lived experience and the historical view, which is going to be really awesome.
Yeah, it's going to be great.
My generation doesn't have a category, but my name is Merrily Pierce, and I have lived in the McLean community for over 50 years, and I am a native of Washington, D.C., but I have also spent a lot of my adult life living in Europe and other countries.
Oh, I didn't know that. Paul, would you mind saying your name and generation for me?
Hi, I'm Paul Kohlenberger. I'm a millennial.
And we were lucky to connect because I was looking for information about McLean, Virginia, more context. As it's cited in Millennials Rising, it becomes the part of the central thesis of how millennials are living and existing in the world at the time of that publication. And I did some examination of census records to start looking at it. And I wanted to talk to people, since I'm located in Arizona, I wanted to talk to people who knew McLean better, who knew some of the history. And so could I have found two more qualified and knowledgeable people? Maybe not. Would you speak about the book that you guys have written, the history that you've written?
Well, I'll give a quick overview of how it came to be. It came to be out of sheer panic because 2013 came around and the McLean Citizens Association was approaching its centennial in 2014, and nobody could pin down the accomplishments of the organization. And I thought, well, you can't go forward without understanding what an organization has done for 100 years. I happened to have been in an environment committee meeting at the time, and Paul was sitting in the corner, and I was moaning and groaning, oh my gosh, I've got to get started on putting this history together. And at the time, I believe, Paul, you were president of the McLean Historical Society. And he said, I will help. And that's what gave me the courage to jump in with both feet. I had no idea how long it would take us to write the history of the MCA, never mind how many hours we spent in the county archives, running around McLean. So a year and a half later, we synthesized it all down to summaries by 10 years. So it was easily digestible, and put it into a booklet so that we wound up with 100 years of significant accomplishments by decade. I realized that if anybody was going to do it, I was going to have to do it. And would not probably have taken that step if Paul hadn't said, I will help, because it's clearly going to be a humongous task. And
too much for one person.
Too much for one person to approach. And Paul had, I think, better knowledge of chronology even than I did. But
I was about to say I was completely unqualified in comparison. It was pure hubris on my part. No, but I had been on that committee and heard that Merrily needed help. I knew her as someone of substance in the community that had given a lot, and for whom the MCA was important. And as she mentioned, I was serving as president of the McLean Historical Society at that time, and working with the County Historical Society as well. And I just think that milestones are important, and understanding a community's history is very important for giving people a sense of belonging. And as we found, the history of the McLean Citizens Association is in many ways the history of McLean as a community. As you can imagine, an advocacy organization that looks at and works for the community interest in governmental senses and charitable senses is going to end up touching sort of anything that relates to the community. And in the case of the MCA, it started as the School and Civic League. So it was people that were rallying around the first consolidated community school in Fairfax County. It had literally been, until that point, one-room schoolhouses dotting the landscape every few miles. So that school changed everything. And then the MCA coming in and fundraising for blackboards and chalk and globes and books for a library really sort of
literally it was an empty building when the first principal came in, and she established the School and Civic League. So she was our founder, basically, because she needed supplies for the school. They didn't even have desks.
It's interesting to read in the booklet that how the needs of the community changed over the decades, from really basic organizational things to discussions about, we're going to build a light rail system. And you could see that evolution. It's like Sim City. You start out in this almost agrarian, like, to Paul's point, we need blackboards. We have these schools and we don't have chalk in here. We need to figure this part out. To, okay, we've got this amazing city that we've built, and we need to figure out what's the next evolution of it and how does it expand from there. And Paul, what is your background? That you said hubris, but I feel like you are being self-facing.
I am to some extent. So I was born in Hinsdale, Illinois, and my family moved here when I was an infant. So I've been in McLean since 1985. We moved around a little bit, Singapore and Philadelphia and such, but I'd grown up here and had the blessing of having a mother that had been a librarian, but she stayed home with me and always took me to the local library and the community center and the various historic sites and parks around. The community was always sort of very important and grounding for me, especially because we did periodically move different places for a year or two at a time. So coming back was always sort of feeling like, a grounded place that was important. Professionally, I've done some work in public affairs. I've worked in small private equity firm. I've run the Greater McLean Chamber of Commerce. So a lot of those things have been working with people locally, trying to start and sustain their businesses. I've been very let's say bathed in the McLean civic life for many years.
And how do you guys, from your individual and collective perspectives, how do you describe McLean, and what are the people that live there like?
I think there are two McLeans, really. It's really interesting because McLean was rural and self-sufficient, although closely related across the river from Washington, D.C. The county seat was 15 miles away from McLean. And so people shopped and basically worked in downtown Washington. So it was the people who did not work professionally in Washington were dairy farmers.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a heavily rural community until World War II. And shortly after World War II, of course, the federal government expanded exponentially. At that time, many people came to the Washington area to work. But with the establishment in the late 1950s, we like to call this the perfect storm, certainly in our chapter. The CIA was Langley, which is a neighborhood of McLean, was selected as a location that brought in 10,000 employees suddenly, where there was farmland. And not only that, then the interstate highway, we ran the Beltway, which basically cut McLean in half.
Yeah, and then all the contractors start moving,
and then
and
then of course it just development just mushroomed, and so McLean is basically from that particular period. We are, and of course the community seeing more and more development, that there was an incredible push for let's protect what we've got, and so we have more parkland here than other districts in Fairfax County. But we have basically two McLeans. We've got inside the Beltway, where you have your smaller lot sizes. Our business downtown is inside the Beltway.
Mm-hmm.
The more affordable housing is inside the Beltway, and outside the Beltway, we have our larger lots, our custom homes, and parkland. So they're basically the Beltway cut us in half, the historic greater McLean community. And though we share obviously a common history, it's very different now since the Beltway came in.
And what year was that?
That was late 50s, early 60s. The Beltway opened in 62.
Okay. Paul, what's your thoughts on the people who live there and what McLean is like?
It's like Lake Wobegon. We're all above average. No, I think there's a tendency to see McLean as sort of just an affluent suburb, and I think it is. But as Merrily sort of indicated, there's quite, as with anything humane, as you look more closely, there's quite a lot of complexity.
Yes.
I literally have friends to this day whose families were part of a sort of southern landed aristocracy in the 19th century. And there's still, up until about 15, 20 years ago, the Lee family of Robert E. Lee fame owned property here in McLean. And at the same time, that obviously, as she said, has shifted towards mid-century. You had a lot of government workers. There's still plenty of people that are retirees from the federal or county or state government living on a pension, normal people living in 2,000 square foot houses.
Right. And
then over the last 30, 40 years, we have, literal billionaires. There's quite a lot of diversity of experience. It's 25% foreign born at this point.
Yeah,
yes.
Huge impact.
Yeah.
Right.
A lot of international, and you've both spent times living internationally as well. So your perspective not only on McLean as an American city, but also as a global city, because you have both spent time outside the U.S.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say the Cold War had an enormous effect. I was just reading a book. There's an interesting sort of social history of the Cold War, looking spatially at the different agencies, the different facilities that were built out, not least the CIA here in town, which has driven, frankly, a lot of population influx from the former Soviet Union, from places in Asia. So I think that's another sort of thread that's quite interesting. We have Queen Noor of Jordan has lived here in McLean. Exiles. it's been a relatively stable community, but you've seen a lot of there's a very cosmopolitan aspect. One of my best friends growing up was, you know, a British diplomat's son.
The community is stable because of the presence of the federal government and government contractors, which of course are very well established in Fairfax County. But I think of an example when we decided to live, had an opportunity to live in Europe for 5, 6, 7 years. And one reason we did so was to acclimate our children to living with different cultures. We wanted them to have the opportunity to have know people of different races and cultures and languages, and to have that exposure. And I always think when we came back and I took my son to the elementary school up the road and was surprised, though I shouldn't have been, that above the cafeteria, the word cafeteria was written in 37 languages. So while we were overseas, the world I felt had moved here. So my son had the benefit of going to school with basically an international class.
That's a great experience to have that exposure to all those different influences. Do you think that the proximity to DC, the proximity to federal government, the proximity to Langley maybe, and those contractors, is that the biggest influence on what McLean has grown into?
It certainly has driven the high cost of real estate. Certainly we have undergone in the last 20, 30 years, certainly since the early 90s, McMansionization, which has happened in many urban areas as one generation transitions out and older houses are torn down and replaced. But we also, we have many people who are heads of think tanks and research organizations that are government contractors, basically. So a number of corporate heads now. We've got some of the larger office buildings. We've got Google, Amazon has come to Fairfax County now. So people move for proximity to Washington, D.C. And their elected officials. As a result, people are able to afford more, and so the cost of housing has gone through the roof. It takes now today, when we lived in McLean, you could buy a good 4-bedroom house for under $100,000. And that's unheard of today. The same size house now goes for over $1 million. And a young family cannot handle that. The average rent that you need in order to afford roughly a $500,000 house, which is the average house in Fairfax County, is you need $500,000, or in order to rent a 1-bedroom apartment, you need income of $68,000 a year. In McLean, that's multiplied. In McLean, you need close to $1 million to even have a home. So I would say the community is characterized by, again, those who can afford it.
Yeah, Fairfax, comparing Fairfax County to the average U.S. county is an elevated comparison. And then comparing McLean inside of Fairfax County, it boosts up again. Yeah, so those home values, you could see it going all the way back to the census in 2000.
It has been extraordinarily driven by the role, the growth of the federal government. Federal government's been here since 1789. McLean did not grow dramatically until at least the First World War. And you just track the changes in federal policy, in size, and it lines up almost entirely. The expansion during and after the war created huge pressures, and that's when the suburbanization happened. But until the Second World War, really, it was just a sort of outlying farming community. Truck farming,
small country crossroads, general store, the consolidated school.
And so I would say that there's definitely an element of the sociology about power here in McLean, but it's shifted from a good friend of mine grew up in the 50s over near the CIA, or what became the CIA. And she said all of her neighbors were admirals, generals, congresspeople, agency officials, cabinet secretaries. So there's always been that sort of cachet since the mid-century. But it's really shifted now to more of an economic power. And the community and the county changed. My family moved here when Mobil Oil moved their headquarters down from Manhattan to Fairfax County. And that was one of the first sort of broadening of the economic base, and that, you know, we have been able to draw in other companies just recently to this region, Nestle and Starkist and Volkswagen USA, and it's sort of diversified, but frankly, a lot of that has just changed when the government, as I mentioned a moment ago, when the government during the Reagan years started defense buildups and shifting some of the governmental functions to private sector entities. A lot of the people were doing defense contracting, for instance. The sort of notion of power and the source of power is still very directly related to Washington, but it's sort of at a whole new level than it used to be.
I remember sitting in a restaurant in Tyson's Corner in the mid-aughts, and I was working for Fairfax County at the time, and I overheard a conversation of a couple of young men who clearly were working in one of these think tanks. It was in the middle of the Iraq invasion. And one turned to the other and said, you know, if we have another war, I'll be able to retire, because it was remunerative for him to, again, and these were young men, usually, I guess, mid-30s, but those were the way they were seeing their career prospects.
He said the thing that I fear they think. If we think about Millennials Rising, which was written in the late 90s, I guess as I look at the data of comparing the McLean of the 90s to the US of the 90s, you know, it's all medians and means and averages, so nothing's perfect. But if we can go back in time together, did you, and Paul, you were young, I think, when that, and pretty new in your time there maybe, but how did McLean feel then as a, you know, exemplar of the US? Would you say at that time period, at the turn of the century, was it pretty good example of life and culture in the US, or was it different? I mean, home values aside.
I felt it was very middle class, comfortable middle class. There were, of course, McLean still had the cachet, and Great Falls had the cachet of being privileged and wealthy. It was not unusual, for instance, 16-year-olds to get sports cars or expensive cars for their 16th birthday, while your teachers were driving lesser models. So I was conscious. I always thought of myself as middle class. I lived in a typical standard subdivision, but I was very conscious of that there was significant wealth around me. And my daughter came home from school one day after visiting a friend, and she said, "Mom, I was so embarrassed. I had to ask where the front door was because the house was so large." So there was 20
bathrooms. You don't know which one.
There was that difference. We have a lot of community organizations that bind the community. McLean Citizens Association, of course, from which all the others sprang.
Yes.
But those organizations were very well attended, and membership was high in them. And I have noticed as years have gone by, the membership waxes and wanes depending upon, again, generations and the interest.
Interesting. Paul, what are your memories of McLean at that time?
Nursery school.
McLean, Merrily's right in the sense that McLean at that time was a privileged community, and had been for many decades, frankly. That's really started with the Kennedys moving out, Hugh Auchincloss and Gore Vidal, and a number of people buying, you know, big places, and that sort of drew a number of people starting in the 50s. It was still in the late 90s, I would say, a better representation of the country than it probably would be today. It was more of a place that if you had done well, you could move before or as you were starting a family. Today, you must more or less be established to be here. So I think that has changed some matters. I think it's represented, frankly, the broader sociological change related to two parent families, both in the workforce.
Yeah, and class structure in general in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. It's just it's partly just the land economics are such that you had a greater amount of housing stock that was sort of typical for Americans. My wife grew up in a neighborhood of mid-century 2,000 square foot houses, sort of a typical mid-century suburb. And I was talking to one of her parents' neighbors who I also know some years ago, and that person had a party for her 6 or 7 year old kids, and one of the kids grew up in another part of McLean, and literally completely innocently came in and said, "Where's the rest of your house?" So there's always been that.
Yeah, so it's like you can't find the front door.
Yeah.
So there has it. I would say just like a lot of those. The extent to which there's income inequality even with McLean, I think within McLean has widened. There were people that in the 80s and 90s and such were working. I know one family that one worked at the community center and one was a biology teacher at the local high school, and they could afford a house, they could raise a family comfortably.
Except they can't do that anymore.
That's just not even. It's unthinkable unless you have family money or some other support that you're working.
And that's it. So I don't like to describe McLean this way, but I think the two words that come to mind are privileged and wealthy.
And it's consistent with growing metros across the country where that divide of privilege has sort of stepped in and then created a little bit of a chasm for people on one side or the other. And you mentioned Merrily 2 McLeans, but you were talking about geographically the inside and outside of the Beltway.
Right.
There's also, and it's not exclusive to McLean, there's also the economic reality of, when home prices get that out of hand, to Paul's other point, you do have to be established to get into those neighborhoods, and that creates an aspiration. It creates a little bit of a separation in a lot of cases. You've both talked about, and in the booklet that you produced, there's a lot of community ties, a lot of community fabric. And I wonder, going back to the 90s, when we were looking back, you mentioned how strong those were. I wonder over the past 20-ish years, as the economics have changed, has that community fabric held? How has it evolved? Is it still pretty strong? You're both obviously still involved.
Again, it ebbs and flows, and I found it's age separated, segregated. You find that your PTAs obviously are school age. Your parents who have school age kids. Our community organizations now tend to gravitate toward the retired. Because it takes a 2-income family. A lot of our organizations used to be heavily women who stayed home, who did not work, basically formed the core of our earlier civic associations.
Okay.
And that's definitely not the case. The women have basically gone to work or spend their time at their jobs now. But it seems to be age segregated, where we had the expertise and the institutional knowledge with our older and retired people. That I wouldn't say that's the majority of our civic organizations.
I would say the McLean area retains a surprising network and fabric of organizations that help establish identity and provide some sense of grounding for being a place that is more or less a zip code or two. Mm-hmm. Insofar as, again, it is not an incorporated town or city or municipality. It has suffered from the changes we discussed earlier, 2-earner families, from the broader decline in the joining culture, the bowling alone thing, from a change technologically driven, obviously, in as to how people connect and what is important to them from a location or geographically based identity or forum in which to act, to more specialized, interest-based, and
we have such a mix of cultures here. Heavily Asian is our next largest proportion, and then Hispanic, and cultural organizations such as the ones that we've been associated with aren't necessarily part of that culture. And we've tried recruiting broader to increase diversity. And we do have some diversity in the McLean Citizens Association, but I would not say not as representative of the community as we would like.
So going back to the 2000s when people were thinking about millennials as the generation. So Paul, you were probably not actively thinking about yourself as a generation. You were probably just trying to get through high school and college.
Yep.
But Merrily, maybe we'll start with you. And when they talked about the youth, I believe you said you had read Millennials Rising or talked to Bill Strauss at the time he was working on the book. How did you think about the youth then in local to McLean and based on what you knew about, the kids in the neighborhood?
Again, they were just coming out of, I guess, drugs had been a problem earlier in the 70s and the 80s. And there was, people were very, very conscious of keeping kids safe and trying to make certain that you didn't have huge house parties on the weekends.
Yeah, that's still a concern.
But that was a big thing.
It didn't work.
Yeah.
And I thought, but no, the word always got out. The word always got out. But that kind of thing was going on. But also it was the initiation of the internet too. And everybody, including parents at the time, everybody was sort of naive as to the potential that we had seen realized with the internet today. There was a tremendous feeling of optimism that the internet was going to bring everybody together. It was going to be a great source for education, and particularly in schools for teachers.
Yeah.
And a lot of people did not have computers at home, but that was coming. More people were beginning to get computers. And Harry Potter was really big. So you had a generation that was heavily into reading the next adventure. But you also had the pressures of the international pressures. I always think of growing up in Washington. I always got the Washington Post on my doorstep every morning. So the world was literally at my front doorstep, and you tend to think more internationally than you do local, even though we used to get our local papers. So international events tend to impact not only families because people are involved in the various agencies of the government, but the kids absorb what's going on around them, and they absorb the evening news. And of course, you had Y2K, which had everybody was hysterical at the end of the century.
Yes, I remember.
Going to collapse, and but that permeates with the family. And then you had 9/11, where suddenly everything was protect me from terror. And building
real
suddenly,
fear,
right?
Yeah.
And suddenly, real fear, and suddenly everything was what became locked down, and you had to have IDs to get in anywhere. And our young people absorb this, and parents absorb this and become more protectionist. You want to protect your kids from all of the threats that are out there. So that's combination here of community, of the security and the stability of your community versus the maelstrom beyond the radius of your neighborhood, but that's happening because your parents are involved in State Department, or you've seen the headlines in the newspaper that came on your front porch that morning. So it must have been a time of turmoil for young people beginning to go on their own to face a world that probably from the Washington point of view was perhaps more frightening than if you were in the middle of another, Midwest or elsewhere. I always know when I go visit my uncle in San Diego how different the world seems because things are so different issues and the newspapers are different. So different perspective. In Washington, I think, gives you that international and that government component that young people grow up with that I don't think is so prevalent in the rest of the country.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Paul, were you aware of the millennial identity at that point?
No. Forgive me, but
no,
no.
it's good.
I think the 90s in McLean and elsewhere, we're sort of an interregnum between, frankly, a lot of turmoil internationally and domestically of the 80s, 70s, and 80s, and the last 20 years we've had here with 9/11, et cetera. It was, I think, a time of frankly, of conformity, of yes, safety, but things were good in the 90s, and it was a great time to grow up. I think in a way it did a disservice to the generation given the upheaval of the following decade, both internationally and obviously economically, which has been, the Great Recession was very difficult on millennials. I remember morning of 9/11, we had, Black suburbans whisking away a son of a Saudi prince from our school. It was quite different, and as Merrily said, I think it shifted the sociology to one much more wary of things.
I do want to ask about how, if the issues that you thought about the youth then, Merrily, and Paul, how you view the youth today, maybe your own kids or the kids that are graduating high school and, in that phase, how do you think about the concerns, the defining issues around that group compared to the millennial generation?
Oh, very definitely. I'd say major difference. Of course, parents have always been very ambitious for their children in this community. And educational excellence is probably a priority in every family.
Yeah.
And kids are pushed into, but they push the public school system to one more gifted program, and we have a special line in high school that kids start in tutoring classes at the age of 3 so that they'll qualify in high school. But I have noticed now that, speaking of institutional sports, that kids are much more organized into basically a success track. You pay significant monies to participate in traveling teams so that you can excel in sports from a fairly early age. In many cases, with hopes that you'll win a scholarship, because the cost of college has, just gone out of sight. Even when I was going to school, and even when our kids were in school and college was expensive, we never even considered taking out a student loan. Whereas now that's almost you almost have to have loans in order to afford a $70,000 a year at college if you're going to private college, and even our state schools. So the cost of college, I think, has driven parents to make certain that their kids get the most out of public schools. So you've got more AP classes,
yes,
more advanced classes. So some kids are taking 2, 3, and 4, advanced classes, hoping to, again, get into a better school or not have to take so many courses in college. I'm seeing students with much less free time on their hands because they're studying so hard and working so hard. I mean, we certainly wanted the best for our kids, and our kids all took music lessons and belonged to this, but I don't remember the pressure that I see my friends, children under these days.
Yeah.
We've had over the last 10 years a rash of suicides at McLean and Langley high schools. It has become, frankly, a quite a big problem.
That's terrible.
Yeah, I guess these are Gen X parents, so they're typically seen as a little bit more laid back. So I think it's more of the global pressure. You're trying to compete on a global stage. You're seeing, with social media, you're seeing peer comparisons. So there's that added pressure. And I think, as I said earlier, like this particular community has always been,
highly competitive.
There's certainly been an achievement focus in this particular community for sure.
Do you think it's amplified because you have an international community in McLean? Do you think it's worse there, definitely. Or do you think, because you're both well-traveled, do you think across the country it's like, I can say a lot of what Merrily described sounds consistent with what I experience here in Arizona, but I wonder.
It's true in urban areas in general, I think. But
yeah, do you think it's even amplified though? Because, Paul, to your point about global competition, like they are actually seeing people from other parts of the world and realizing
Or
wow,
they're going to
there's
school. They're going to school with kids from other parts of the world.
right. And it's like the more we're
And
exposed to the
but
world,
there,
the more we see
but
like somebody
but
is
the
always going to be better.
Yes.
but there's also there's a large house syndrome. There's the push to have more, basically. I think that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on young people, for those kids whose parents, can't afford a lot of the things, but there are a lot of kids who have a lot
Mhm.
and are very privileged, and they want to be able to maintain that lifestyle. A friend of mine's daughter recently asked her, "How, Mom, where do I go to college so I can be rich?" Because I want to, because
That's a crushing question.
It is. And it's frightening, because you want your kid to go to school so they'll learn a profession or learn to love learning.
They will be enriched.
But
Exactly.
yeah, enriched, very yeah. But there's, again, we're seeing more and more people want to be able to maintain the lifestyle in which they're living. And that's where I come down to privilege and wealth. And I don't like to really describe my community like that, but I see an element of that. But I also see an element of families that work very hard, husband and wife, every day, and
Yeah.
they are not very, very, as you would say, overly wealthy. They don't live in 10,000, 20,000 square foot homes.
I was going to say, in terms of the pressure, I think it relates to also the fact that the broader trend of having, as societies get richer, they typically have fewer children. And so sort of all of the sort of hopes and dreams of the parents are focused on fewer and fewer children. So I think that creates a thing. I was driving by near your house yesterday, Merrily, and there's probably 100 cars waiting to pick up kids at the elementary school. When I was going there, I asked my wife, she's a few years younger, you walked or you took the bus?
Right.
There's a lot of sort of care and focus on fewer kids, and I think that sort of increases the pressure under which they're living.
For young people as well, I think it's a difficult environment, because you see a level that you would like to be able to aspire to, which is well beyond the level that other people in other places have had the opportunities. I mean, we have incredible opportunities in this area, but people also have the means to enjoy those opportunities.
And I think that's the downside of being surrounded by so much privilege, is a skewed expectation of basic questions of what is the good life, what is education for, what is success in life. It really isn't necessarily to be the boss or to make the most money. I think there are just a different mentality than there once was.
Yeah, that's not exclusive to McLean, by the way.
But you want your kids to have a satisfying career and a useful life, and
exactly, and an honorable life. And I think it's become harder with the slow decline of civic associations and of a civic life. Makes it
where everybody works together for the betterment,
and where everyone knows, where people know each other and see each other as humans and say, I know that guy, oh, he's maybe absent-minded, but he's a real person and he's a good person, and we want to work with them, and we're stuck with him because he lives down the street,
so we'll figure out how to solve this problem together.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever it is,
it's just everything's sort of siloed, both siloed within your house or everywhere. I think that's a major social change that hasn't been to the good.
Let me bring up one other thing, and that's the decline of our local newspapers, where our organizations basically used to be focused, and activities used to be focused. And so you knew who the community leaders were, and those were the leaders from whom your elected officials arose. You basically had a hierarchy. You belonged to this civic association, or you belonged to the school board, but there was a hierarchy that you sort of participated in, and then you were ready to run for office. But the community all knew, because you got the newspaper every week. You knew who you're basically the leaders in the community were, so that there was an identity.
And it it was a real person that you knew how to get a hold of
It was
and
a
talk
real
to.
person, and also our elected officials were held accountable because everybody paid attention to what they were doing because it was in the local newspaper. We don't have that anymore, and so now when we have people running for office, the question is, what kind of experience, what kind of civic experience does this person have? Where is this person coming from? And why is this person running for office? So I think we have, in the last 20 years, I think we have erased, I think, one of the more valuable, cohesive aspects of that brought McLean together, where everybody had a common theme of conversation because it was in the local paper.
Yeah, excellent. Merrily, Paul, thank you so much for making time. This was very rich discussion. I'm so grateful to have your knowledge, context, and experience. I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation and filling me in on a lot of this valuable information.
I am glad to be introduced to your podcast, which I follow now.
Excellent.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate your work.
Yes.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate you both.
On the next episode of In the Demo, Farrah and Adam talk to a person who was there at the beginning of the Millennial Myth. The very beginning. About her role and her view on the generation and where it sits today. I'm your robot host, Eliza. Please be kind. In the Demo is produced by Farrah Bostic and Adam Pierno, with support from the Difference Engine. Music by Omega Man, under the Creative Commons license. Go to inthedemopodcast.com for behind-the-scenes research and supporting information.